So without further ado, I turn it over to Caitlin. Caitlin, all you.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
I'm Caitlin Angelone. I am the archivist at Elwyn. So first I want to thank Delaware County Historical Society for having me today to talk about Elwyn's history, and I want to thank you all for coming. I also want to just put this up there to say that this presentation may contain some language that just is not suitable by modern standards when discussing disability. We are an organization that dates back to 1852, so it is hard not to say these words or they may appear. Obviously, Elwyn does not condone the modern use of this kind of language, and I'm sure as lovers of history, we all know that language evolves and changes over time. First, I'll touch briefly on what Elwyn does now, just because I think that is important to understand the context of our history. So Elwyn is located in Media, Pennsylvania. It's actually pretty much right down the street over here if you've never been over there. I did hear some people take walks over there. We have locations throughout Pennsylvania and in 8 other states. Elwyn invests in excellence, enduring engagement, and compassionate care to shape a world in which people with developmental and behavioral health challenges experience equity, opportunity, and happiness. They serve over 20,000 individuals a year, and they provide education, rehabilitation, child welfare services, assisted living, residential programs, and other daily living supports. So a lot of different things go on over at Elwyn. And most importantly for this discussion, we are the oldest organization of its kind in the United States. So before we go into Elwyn completely, I will give a very, very brief history of disability on here, just because, again, it's very important to understand in terms of how Elwyn came to be. And I want to make it clear I am not a historian on the history of disability, but I do know it in the context of how it's been important to Elwyn. So Elwyn came about in a time where there was increased social and industrial change in America. Individuals with disabilities have obviously always existed. It's not like it's a new thing, but their roles in society have always evolved and changed. In antiquity times, so we're talking antiquity like Greek, Roman times, a lot of times families giving birth to individuals with congenital disformities or disabilities were actually encouraged to kill their children or leave them to the side because they were a lot of times seen as not useful to society, or they could also be seen as a bad omen. So killing the child would actually, give less of a burden of whatever, God was bestowing upon them. So there was a lot of gaze on these individuals that they were having cast upon them. We're going to fast forward a lot now to, let's say, the colonial period. We then also start to see mistreatment happening, but it is starting to slowly progress. We have maybe not as drastic as death, but a lot of people do end up in prisons, almshouses, homelessness. It was hard to help individuals navigate society just based off of work. Education was not available. Families weren't really sure what to do with their individuals that may need help in systems. The systems just did not exist without the proper support. Around this time, so 1852, when Elwyn starts, we start to see a slow change happening. We have physicians and educators. We're getting a better scientific understanding of disability. So we have no longer, necessarily seeing it as acts of God. They're now understanding that these things happen naturally. Some big names at this time, like Dorothea Dix and Samuel Gridley Howe, are beginning a more sympathetic approach to individuals. And it wasn't always devoid, it was sometimes devoid of empathy though, so you will see that in earlier times is there's sympathy but not always empathy going on hand in hand. There was a realization that not all disabilities were the same as well. So at a time, usually a lot of times it would be, maybe someone has a hearing impairment, there may be an assumed idea that they also have an intellectual disability. Obviously, now we know that is not always true. Sometimes it is, sometimes that goes hand in hand, sometimes it doesn't. But this was an era where that was not going on. They just did not understand it. We also have industrialization beginning to influence the roles. The United States during this time was more agrarian in nature, so a lot of farms, especially in this area around here. And individuals with a child who had a disability could have their child help them on their farm. So maybe, a child is missing an arm or something. They could have them figure out ways to help them on their farm, to help each other in the communities. But now we're seeing a shift into industrialization. Mega mass farming is happening. It's no longer small communities helping one another. And that left a big void with individuals with disability who might not be able to keep up in that type of society. And it also made it hard for parents, not only because it was already hard for a parent, but now they're having to kind of choose sometimes of how they're going to work because they might need to go into factories. And then there was also the fear of what is going to happen to their child when they pass along. How is my child going to survive in this new society? So the start of Elwyn, I think there's going to be a slight lag. So the start of Elwyn was founded in 1852 by Alfred Elwyn and James B. Richards. And Alfred Elwyn was a physician, and James B. Richards, that's James B. Richards there, he was an educator. So Alfred Elwyn was an officer at the Pennsylvania Institution for the Instruction of the Blind, and James B. Richards had started a small school in Germantown, Pennsylvania. So that's like the Philadelphia section of Germantown, where he started. He was working, again, mostly with individuals with hearing loss, but he began to see a need in the community for individuals with intellectual disability. So they both began a school for the training of intellectually disabled children. And our original name was the Pennsylvania Training School for the Idiotic and Feeble-Minded Children. So again, that's where that language comes in, but that was considered okay language at the time. And I do always like to note that by 1856, so only like 4 years after we started, they actually dropped idiotic because it was already changing that fast, the kind of movement away into better terms that were more nicer and kinder. So they bought the current land that we have in Media, so again, kind of right down the road over there, in 1854. It was just a farm. It had a small farmhouse on it, and they began to construct a new building, and that building was completed in 1859. And the 25 students that were held in that schoolhouse in Germantown moved their way over to the new schoolhouse, and within a year, they actually doubled their capacity of the amount of students that they had. So they had about 50 students by the end of the year that they were able to treat, and they continue to grow. So some things, sorry, it seems like the scale's off here, but sorry about that. Some things that I find important in our collection. So I do want to state, I didn't say this at the beginning, that I will be pulling some things from our collection to kind of show our history. And I figured that would be a good idea with this type of crowd to see the actual firsthand documents of things that we have in our collection. So this is our first annual report here. And in this first annual report, it's fairly notable that they state the plans for Elwyn. So they kind of lay out, and that's what it should say here, and not as jumbled, but pretty much what they're saying is that they believe that these people can be made useful in the community. Again, this idea of usefulness, not necessarily that they can just exist, but they should be made useful, which was a common idea at the time. They believe that the hearing impaired were being taught, therefore individuals with intellectual disabilities could also be taught, which was a novel idea at the time. And again, this emphasis on usefulness, but they did believe that these individuals needed dignity and respect. So the success of the students of the area, I picked this. This is in the first annual report as well. And we don't know the name of this student, But the name of this, we don't know the name of the student, but this is a student of James B. Richards that he claims he got the student at the age of 5, and he was unable to feed himself, he wasn't able to walk, he wasn't able to communicate his needs. His mother still fed him milk because he wasn't able to eat. And the child was eating about a gallon of milk a day. And not only was that expensive for the family, but it was also not giving the child the proper nutrition they needed as a 5-year-old. The one thing that he really enjoyed and loved was music. So that was the only thing that gave him lively air. So what Richard says at this point is that this child is a work of creation and education. So he, at this point, was saying that a actual curriculum and kind of a individualized approach needed to be created for this child to educate him. So after 3 years, Richards then claims this child was able to walk, sit at the table, feed himself, and communicate his needs, and he learned how to read. So what Richards was doing is essentially, individualized education, which was very rare at the time. And another thing he always points out is that if this student had gotten help before, he will, continue to do well. So that's essentially early intervention, which did not exist at the time. There wasn't this idea that if we help a child that needs something early in their life, they're going to come out ahead. That was a novel idea at the time. So Richards had a lot to do with the idea of early intervention, and obviously we know that's something that a lot of individuals do today for their students. So more success of the students. There is a idea that children want to assist and learn. So that was a big thing at the school, was having the children actually assist the teachers in things and tasks. Because we know now in education that a lot of students do naturally want to help out their peers. They want to help out their instructors. So that was done. Experimental learning, such as finding tools and way to help students achieve their goals. So the idea of just even say, a child has a play kitchen, and you're essentially learning how to use a kitchen when you're, have a play kitchen. But they would tell the child exactly what was in that kitchen. So instead of an assumption that the child's going to understand things, they might say, this towel is soft, the towel wipes things, the towel is made of threads. And, that might be common now, this idea, but it was revolutionary at the time. And it also really spoke to the needs of individuals with disability, because as we know now, a child on the spectrum might not automatically know those things that some people may get automatically. They kind of have, a barrier there. So this helped students that needed specific cues and ideas on how to function with everyday materials. And so they would also do daily routines. So daily routines were very important in part of the school. So the students did live there. As much as they did have free time, it's not like they were working them into the ground every day. But there was a routine. So students got up at 6 a.m. The matrons would help them get ready. And the idea was slowly the matrons would, kind of remove their help, and the student would gain confidence and be able to get ready on their own. And if the student couldn't, then they would just continue to do what they could. And they also did this by students depending on their needs. So again, individualized approaches to each student. There was also a lot of success because of our neighbors. So Elwyn relied on generous supports from their surrounding community. There's things such as offering day and visiting day that raised money for entertainment funds and allowed families and friends to support students to see their success. So this is a broadside here that is advertising offering day, which is kind of similar if you are from the area. There's Elwyn Day now, where the community can come and hang out and support the students. This is essentially the same thing, but in 1860. And it actually was a success because of women in the area. So even though, again, this is 1852, so most of this stuff was run by men, A lot of women did have a role. If they were especially married to these men, they would do different things. And Offering Day was actually the brainchild of Mrs. Caroline Pinnock, Mrs. Sally Crozer, who was the wife of John Price Crozer, and Abigail Cheney Crozer, the wife of Samuel Crozer, which was his son. And they decided to start Offering Day, and it was essentially people came to campus, they watched the children do different educational exercises to show what they've learned, and there was a yard sale. So people could bring things they didn't want, and people would sell them, and then all the money went directly to the students, which was also an interesting notion at the time. They went to the students to provide entertainment to the students. So it didn't go, into the board members' pockets. It went to providing entertainment to the children. And then I was going to touch a little bit on Elwyn and the Civil War, just because it did kind of create a new change for Elwyn. And there's usually always interest in the Civil War. And since we are around in 1852, we do have some ties to the Civil War. So this did cause a few different ways of change in Elwyn. We had change in leadership during this time. So Joseph Parrish was the superintendent, and he ended up leaving to head the sanitary commission, which allowed space for someone else to move in. And this was essential, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Isaac Curlin, who did become the new superintendent, also left for a little while. President Lincoln asked him to serve on this commission as well, and he left to become a soldier. And we had at least 2 students join the Army as well. Unfortunately, they are unnamed. We don't know their names. They are written in the annual report, and one ended up dying in the Andersonville camp. So I think it is important to mention this as well, just because I always imagine the fear the students were probably fearing at this time. There was a lot going on. There was a lot of changes happening, and their own students were leaving as well to help the war effort. There was also a lot of financial strain. So the Confederacy had stopped the postal service, which made it hard for them to receive payments from not only northern states, but southern states as well. Elwyn did receive students from all over the country, even during this time. So they did have some southern students. And some of those students ended up remaining, but they did actually end up sending some of the students home that they weren't able to get payments for. And this was one because they obviously weren't able to care for the students because of money, but they also did see it as a way to show their stance that they were abolitionists and that they weren't going to house students that were part of the Confederacy. This also ended up forcing Elwyn kind of into more of a traditional colony model. So that would mean kind of relying on one another and things within those closed walls. And that essentially was coming from inflation from the war, but it also is coming into an era of eugenics, which we'll get to in a little bit. And we'll get to that right now. So the medical years. That will come up in a second. So the medical years are really ushered in by Isaac Curlin. So he began in 1864, right after Parrish resigned. He ended up serving Elwyn for 29 years. So Isaac Curlin is here for a long, long time, and he's actually buried on the campus at Elwyn. He dedicated pretty much his whole life to Elwyn, for better and for worse. At one point, he was the nation's expert on education and care for individuals with disability. And he ended up writing The Mind Unveiled, which is the first photographically illustrated medical book at the time. And it's kind of an unscientific chronicle of Curlin's work. I think you can actually find it online for free. It's pretty much just him talking about what he's done with the students and all the success they've been having about the students. And he kind of was into the idea of custodial grounds and a great administrator. He set up Elwyn with electricity. They had working phones, way before most of Delaware County even had these things. But he did have a bad side. He was a eugenicist. So if we don't know what eugenics are, it's the idea of selective breeding. So he did kind of have that twist to Elwyn during his reign, as he believed individuals that were in his care were kind of, lesser, and that there were going to be ways in which, maybe we can get rid of that. And that wasn't just at Elwyn, that was kind of sweeping across the nation at this time. And you see that in some of our texts here. So this is the idiocy and etiology descriptive blanks. These were questionnaires that the parents were, or physicians, whoever was admitting the child to Elwyn, this is what they would fill out. There was 2 sets of them. You had the first set, which was more so about the student's needs. So again, we were talking about individualized care. What does the student already know? What can they do already? Do they know their alphabet? Can they draw? Did they get vaccines? Did they get smallpox? Kind of information like that. But then we get into the etiology blanks, and that's kind of where we start to get into the eugenics territory. And this was kind of before some of the, real eugenics movement was happening. And this was kind of trying to chronicle what was, wrong with the family in terms of why did this child turn out the way they are. And you'll see different explanations. You'll see some questions like things such as, alcohol, opium, what ages people were. Ethnicities, things like that. But you'll also see some other different things that I found interesting when I've been looking through them, such as the attempting of the public to understand, medical and education, because you'll see some kind of like old world type answers in this, and I've picked out a few. So one was that Clara was conceived not of wedlock. While she was carrying her, a young Irishman who wanted her to marry him was enraged, and at her confession, frightened her with some dead snakes. And that caused the child to have an intellectual disability. When I was carrying said child, my oldest son with me, he saw a snake and told me there of the snake, and I fainted. I suppose that may be the cause. The only shock I ever heard her mention was the sight of a crazy man passing the door with his tattered garments tied over with straws and rags trailing after her. She confessed to having felt afraid in him and was in pregnancy at the time. The child, when old enough to play, once spread a piece of ragged carpet over her as a shawl, and it struck the mother forcefully when she saw it, not then made the discovery of the weakness of the child's mind. Or, during the Civil War, I was anxious about the drafts. So you see this idea of them trying to understand. Obviously, we do know, there is a certain extent that stress on a mother can, cause, issues with a child, but not, seeing some dead snakes. So you kind of start to see that, transition of, understanding. And there's also a really great question in some of these where they ask about what the parents hope that their student gains from education at Elwyn. And we see a lot of great answers here because I think it does kind of flip this narrative. I think sometimes people think people wanted to just abandon their children and drop them off and never see their children again. And in these answers, you see the complete opposite for the most part. Of course, there's going to be there's unfortunately parents today that don't want their children. But during this era, there was a lot of parents that were very enthusiastic about their child. You'll see things such as that he will learn to read and become fit to make a living for himself when he gets old enough to do so. His mother would be very glad if he could be made useful in employment so that he may help himself. I can't mind the child, and my husband is shiftless, and I must go to work to help support the family. I am a dressmaker. So again, seeing these ideas of people not being able to care because of work, or just, really not knowing what to do with their child because there was no education, there was no public education. Schools did not really exist at this time. So a lot of parents just trying to reach for solutions. We also see a level of detail in Curlin's work. So again, eugenicist, but doing a lot of good work in some ways as well. He was trying to make Elwyn safe and comfortable for students. So we have a scrapbook of his that I took some different clippings from, and he had a very keen eye for administrative details, for handbooks. He actually made a lot of like what we would consider now HR handbooks and would give them to his matrons and orderlies and telling them how to work with the students. One of them here is about children crying, that he is saying don't neglect children, comfort them if they're crying, help them. He actually makes a very good point that many of these children were probably already traumatized by some of the life and being ripped away from their parents, and that they should be given comfort and not just ignored. One of these also talk about don't neglect the students in general. So if the boys are outside playing, the people were supposed to be playing with the children as well and not ignoring them. And I believe one of these literally says, stop talking to women. I know you're talking to women out there. Go play baseball with the boys. So he is trying to get students integrated more and have them as best of a life as possible, even if he is kind of having this idea that they will spend their lives there. And I did forget to mention earlier, too, which I should have, that students were supposed to leave Elwyn. It was never originally a place that they were kept forever. They were supposed to graduate at 16. You do start to see that shift, though, as much of society shifts in their kind of care. Another thing he talks about as well is punishment. So he actually advocates against corporal punishment, which I found interesting when I was reading through some of his scrapbooks, just because, again, a lot of these types of institutions didn't necessarily care about that type of thing. But he believed in treatment and kindness to patients for them. And he was furthering his own education. So here he actually references the children... the Protection of Children from Cruelty, which was established in 1875 and is, I believe, still an organization. It goes by something else now. But he is referencing a talk they had in a publication and saying, you know, this is what is supposed to be happening. We're not supposed to be beating children. We're supposed to be, you know, providing them with ways in which we can log punishments and things. So he does start notebooks. We actually have some of them of what punishments were allowed. And if someone was giving a punishment, they were supposed to write it in a book so he could keep track of them and he could talk to the orderly if he didn't agree with them. And again, since Elwyn had phones, he would actually say, call me if you feel like someone's in a situation that you do not agree with or do not think I'll agree with. Give me a ring and I'll be down there in a minute. So we continue the medical years with Martin Barr, which I'll admit he's not my favorite guy in our history, but I'll talk about him anyway. He coincided again with the two societal shifts of industrialization, and now we're knee deep in the eugenics movement at this point. That's in 1893 he begins. And he also does some things in the field, such as writing one of the first considered textbooks right here of mental defectives and their history, treatment, and training. And he essentially does kind of write a history book on, you know, what has come before him and how they're treating things now. He moves more to a closed sanctuary model. So again, now this idea of keeping students on campus, maybe not letting them leave ever. And he also believes in direct care, mostly because it's a cost-saving measure. So individuals with less complex disabilities might end up caring for people with greater needs. So they're kind of caring for one another. Of course, there's still adults there's orderlies and things, but you might end up with, you know, a child that has ADHD at the time now caring for someone that has Down syndrome. And again, we start to move to more of a custodial and lifelong institutionalization of people that does continue until about the 1960s. But during his time, the students did still have a lot of freedoms that other individuals of these institutions did not have. So, for example, places like Penhurst, if you're familiar with Penhurst, or I grew up down the street from Byberry, a hospital. Since it wasn't necessarily a hospital, it was more of a place of education, the students still did have a lot of freedoms. They had bands and parades. A lot of the students actually would come and do parades down Media, for like 4th of July and things. There were sports leagues. Students were allowed to leave the campus actually and go to like concerts that were going on in Media, or go into Philadelphia even, and visitations of families and vacations were permitted. And he did also have, somewhat in a good way, is that the idea, he allowed these things because repression, he believed, would end up in retrogression. So he believed that if we completely repressed these students and all that they were trying to do, that it would actually end up, harming the student in the end. And I picked some images here just kind of show this time period, and some of these are a little bit before Barr as well. But these ones here, he was very into theater, like kind of creepily into theater in my opinion. And he would put on these crazy elaborate stage shows. So these are actually students, and he would have them also do them with staff. They were very well funded. And there was usually a few each year. The biggest one was the Christmas one. It wasn't always Christmas themed. It was just at Christmas time. They ran for about a month, and people from the area would go and see them. They were kind of used as a fundraiser as well. So even though they were free, the idea was, rich people of the area would come and give money as they watched these shows. You also have the band here that I had mentioned, and some students playing in the playroom. And this is an example of some of the vocational training that was happening at the time. Again, a lot of their work was vocation. So they were learning educational things, but they were also doing vocational work. So learning to build things, learning to make brooms, which we actually have some examples of brooms and things in our archive. Another thing we have of Barr is the parent letters, a lot to and from parents. They span the years of he starts his presidency. And this again kind of shows the narrative that parents miss their child and wanted to visit. So we have a lot of letters, mostly spanning from like 1898 to 1913 of people asking to come see their students, asking for students to go away on vacation with them. And Barr usually did allow this, and would say you can take your kid out for 3 months to go to Atlantic City, wherever they were going. And these letters also did help keep the institution accountable for treatment. So again, I was talking about kind of comparing it to other institutions at the time. Parents were very heavily involved in their students at Elwyn, so this did help not kind of go down the other paths that some of these other institutions did, because there was so much dialogue with parents at the time. So we're going to fast forward some to more, I say modern, but I guess 1960 was pretty long ago. So community-based models. So it began in 1960 with Gerald Clark and continued with Marvin Kivitz in 1979. And Elwyn was one of the first organizations of its time to be kind of deinstitutionalize people. So Gerald Clark, who was a social worker at the time and therapist, believed that people would do better in communities. So he began that work of taking individuals off campus and placing them into things like group homes, integrating them more into communities for work, things that we see today and take for granted. There was the focus on individuals taking rehabilitation, of training. They began official licenses for vocational roles, while before the vocations were kind of like willy-nilly. There was actually, planned different things going on. And there was a lot of services and interest for clubs, religious freedom, even though Elwyn was never necessarily a denominated religious type area. It was mostly Christian. And at this point, they did start to allow different services, or if they didn't have the service, they would provide transportation to different areas for service. And they would just start to allow different interests of individuals. So this is where we start to see a lot of things like the Scout Center that a lot of people in this area seem to know and love. There was a big Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts movement at Elwyn, and we were I believe, the first accredited camp for individuals with intellectual disabilities in the United States. And, we kind of went, the vocational roles kind of changed from, woodworking and things to actual, tech, computers, and kind of keeping up with the times to allow individuals to get jobs. So now we'll move a little more into today. I won't go too much into today just because we're not, here to discuss exactly what Elwyn is doing today. But by the 1980s, rehabilitation models were widely accepted, and Elwyn continued to acclimate to that climate. That's when you do start to see more deinstitutionalization. A lot of this is also increased pressure from families. And I will say, even today, not all families are completely happy with people being off of campus. There is, that line of, some families feel it's better for them to be in a community while, instead of being in a house with 4 other people. But some of this stuff is just kind of mandated by the government about money. Unfortunately, the individualized care that every person needs just still is not happening. So you do see that kind of back and forth sometimes. So you do see pretty much a mass deinstitutionalization at that point, though, especially in the 80s. And it kind of still is happening, I guess. There's less and less people on campus, but we still do provide services on campus. And in 1991, Sandra Cornelius assumes leadership, and we start to see phasing out of older programs, unneeded spaces to reflect small group homes. We begin education programming on local levels, so that was a big step forward in terms of, again, actually educating the families themselves and giving them that power instead of relying on government help. Is if you go into the community and you can help a family understand what is happening with their child, who their child is, they'll be better equipped to help that child. And you see that today. I just chose this just because it is kind of like a modern thing from the archive. So this is an actual newsletter within Elwyn, and this kind of reflects the modern age of what is in our archives and what we're kind of archiving more currently. Well, thank you so much for listening today. And I'm glad to take any questions if you have them. And this is my information here. If for some reason you want to research or you do want a tour of the archive, we are open to the public. You just need to make an appointment with me because we just don't let people walk in. But if you are interested in touring our collection or seeing anything that you saw in here, I'm happy to help you.
What's the strangest thing or most unexpected thing you came across in the archive?
Huh.
Is there anything that sticks out?
That's a good question. Oh, we have a hatchet that I did ask one of our older people there, and he claims, I don't know if this is true, he claims it was used for amputations in the hospital because there was a hospital on campus for many years. It was that's where students went if they were sick, or staff even went there for many years. Like I had heard, I have heard, staff, even up to the 60s would get their, appendix out there at the hospital on campus because they just all lived there and never had to leave. So why not? So I don't know if that's actually what it was used for, but it is gross and corroded, and it may or may not have been used for amputations. Yeah. Yeah.
Was there 2 different stories of pregnant women seeing dead snakes, or was that one?
Yeah, so there's actually, I went through the first book that we have, and I started keeping count of the reasons. There's actually 3 dead snake stories. So snake story, no, dead snakes. Yeah, so there was something going on with dead snakes and women at that period. Really scared of them. Yeah, that's what I kind of always assumed. It was some kind of like devil. Yeah, so yeah. Apparently, yeah. Oh, really? Okay, well then that makes, yeah. So I had gone through, yeah, I had transcribed, I would say I've transcribed about like 30 of the intake forms so far just because they're very long, and that shouldn't be my job all the time, but if I need something like silly to do, I do that. And out of those 30, there was 3 snake stories.
3 dead snakes.
Yeah.
There were 0 live snakes.
I think there might have been 1 live snake, and then there was 2 dead snakes, And then my favorite was the rag one, that like a homeless man walked by and the rags somehow imprinted onto this child in the womb. Yeah, then the child put the rags on, and then the woman connected it all and realized that the hobo man had somehow affected her and put a curse on her, I guess. Yeah. Yeah. So you see a lot of those kinds of stories in there. And they always are interesting to me to kind of see, especially depending on like what region they're from and things. You do end up seeing some kind of like folklore type stuff kind of embedded in there. Oh yeah, no, there's 6,000 intake forms, so come on over. Yeah.
Actually, so I found it interesting when you were talking about how they consistently, in the early days, in the early part of the 19th century, and it's founded, they kept talking about how their primary interest in rehabilitating, quote unquote, these folks was all about putting them to work. And it has a very kind of similar view of how it had a very paternalistic view to it, where it was a matter of like, we'll be able to rehabilitate these people. Did you find anything in your research or time there that showed that there was perhaps cases where that wasn't applied to someone, where it was more like, this is a loss, you can't do anything, or it's more like, oh, they're not that bad, we can get them. Like, I feel like that would have made it a bit more, created much crazier variables or excuses rather for how they cared or treated someone.
Yeah, you do end up seeing that, especially, it's hard to see in a lot of the history just because it's not tracked as well, but you do end up seeing that in Barr's letters. So again, Barr has, aside from the parent ones, he kept letters for his physician years, and then also for the administrative or admission and discharge committee. So you end up seeing those types of things during the discharge committees, where he will be saying this student is a hopeless case, and he actually wants to get rid of them outside of Elwyn. So for him, what he wanted was students that were either trainable or were at least trainable enough that they could then help take care of other people, even if they were never going to leave Elwyn. He wanted to get rid of anyone that was not trainable. And usually what he would recommend for those individuals was sending them, unfortunately, to Penhurst. You would see that a lot, which is like really sad to see written is, take your kid here, or Polk, which was out in more western Pennsylvania, and they had some ties to Elwyn. I believe at Polk, some of the first students at Polk were from Elwyn. There's an article written by one of my colleagues, Brent Ruswick at Westchester. They would put them on trains and send them out to Polk. And a lot of times those were individuals they saw as kind of, useless, or, they couldn't take the care that they needed. So they would send them elsewhere.
Because I find it surprising that even like I suppose for them, like a quote unquote winning case study would have been those individuals they sent to the fight in the Civil War, which is just astounding to think that they did that. Do we know anything about whether or not it was that, or was it really from those individuals who said, I want to go fight?
So there's a mixture of both. For the Civil War, we're not entirely sure, just because it's not.
And with a draft being on.
Yeah. So we had students. We also have a lot of history with World War I and World War II as well, which I just didn't include in here because I only had so much time. But for World War I and World War II, students also left. And some of them were allowed to leave, so that probably must have meant that Dr. Barr, whoever was in time, I guess both times it was Dr. Barr, felt like they were okay to leave. And then some of them, there was at least one case of a student running away. So a student ran away at night to join the army, and he actually ended up dying in one of the last battles over in France. So you do see students willingly leaving or being allowed to leave. I don't think any of our students were in drafts just because probably of the conditions and things, but they do write in some of the annual reports as well. I know one student was accepted into the Marines, and that was kind of seen as a point of pride that they were put so much effort into this child that they graduated and were now part of the Marines. So it's probably a mixture, I guess, of both, of some of these students being able to leave and some of them probably were obviously able to go if they still were admitted into the Army, but for whatever reason, you know, Barr didn't think they were. Yeah.
Since Barr and Curlin were eugenicists, did they sterilize students?
Yes, there are some cases. We don't know exact information, and I'm not just saying that as someone of a representation of Elwyn. We only have it written in like one of the documents claiming that Curlin sterilized, I think it's like 39 boys and 14 girls. So we don't know exactly what they saw in terms of, you know, why they chose, because they weren't sterilizing everyone. So we don't know exactly understand the criteria of why they thought certain things. And Barr, and this is just like common knowledge, Barr was always at the Supreme Court trying to pass sterilization laws. And that's been written about, you know, that he would go to Pennsylvania's Supreme Court and was a proponent of sterilization. We don't have any evidence that he did end up performing any. All we have is the evidence of the ones of Curlin.
When did Elwyn start accepting blacks?
So interestingly enough, from the start. So because the start of our time with Alfred Elwyn and Richards, they were abolitionists. And they were pretty forward thinking at that time because, again, they were kind of under this idea of, you know, doing good for society. So the ideas of like Dorothea Dix and things, you know, even though institutionalization ends up being bad, I don't think that's not what Dorothea Dix really wanted in the end, you know, was mass incarceration of people. That's what she was against. That just kind of society turned it into that again. But they were followers more of her type of movement of like Samuel Gridley Howe. They believed in rehabilitation. So from the start, we actually accepted African American students. And until Curlin's years, they were actually, they weren't segregated as well. So they were taught along students. They slept in the same quarters. During Curlin's time, they do separate them. Again, just Curlin just wasn't, you know, the best guy on the planet. He was, you know, 50-50, I guess. Yeah, mixture of good and bad. All right. Well, thank you so much. And again, any other questions, you can email me here.
Thanks again to Caitlin for coming out. We'd like to thank you all for coming out. Just feel free to follow up with our upcoming lectures again. We're going to be back here in 2 weeks on September 17th, around the same time. So feel free to come out. And thank you all very much. Take care.
Oh, also, our the Delco Downhill Derby,
Yes.
September 27th. Feel free to come. It's a free event. Or if you want to build a soapbox derby cart, you can race it down Edgemont Street.
You said there's beer there.
Yes.
There will be beer
Ship.
there.
We just confirmed today.